the bibliography on the other side, the key text. So if you're interested in social movement theory, then there's some pretty useful information there. In terms of whether we're going to get to any of this session 1, session 2 things is another matter. We're going to play it on a week-by-week basis because, for example, Patricia is coming back next week, so that's going to be an issue. Then it's going to extend into December, but we've really only got 3 weeks because then we've got Christmas problems. So whether we're going to go all the way into January, I'm not quite sure. We'll just sort of play that by ear. We've got a quote, session 1. These are things that are going to come up in the first little section. On the other side of that, there's just some general notes from, it says social movements and protest on the other side. And that really goes back to the origins of this course, which started off, I think, about 1999 in Wales. I was doing a course called Social Movement and Protest with Professor Graham Day, and this kind of developed from that and been adapted from that. You should also have a sheet which has got the National Animal Interest Alliance, and the difference between welfare and rights, which we'll come to. You should have one that says some animal organisations, which I don't think I've photocopied properly. I think you have to flip it over rather than just turn it around. And you'll see at the bottom of that you've got the Irish situation. And the interesting thing about that is that you'll see that the Irish movement as such is much younger than the British one. There's a couple of gaps because, for example, nobody's quite sure about the Irish Anti-Vivisection Society when that started, and Aaron, there's a dispute. They kind of claim that they were formed a lot earlier than they were, so I just left that blank. And then finally, you've got a definition of social movements, the thing that's put together, which is just kind of for background reading and is quite useful in a way. So, today we're split into two. Normally what I would do is I would do the case study toward the end of a course. On this occasion, I'm going to introduce the case study first because a lot of people here are animal advocates, so I wanted to kind of start with something that we're familiar with. And so it's kind of like an ice-breaking kind of session, and it should last about 35 minutes. Then we'll have a break, or take a question after a break. And then we've got the beginning opening statements about social movement theory as well. So that's the kind of rundown that we're hoping to achieve during today. I think that's the preliminary things I need to say. So this is the case study then. And we start with the definition. This is the definition that I put up on Facebook on the event thing. And this is from a dictionary of sociology, Gordon Marshall. And this is quite a basic definition of a social movement, but it's pretty useful. An organised effort by a significant number of people to change or resist change in some major form of society. Now, what we get even from that very basic thing is a clue to what's going on. First of all, some movements are there to forge change, and other movements are there to resist change. Sometimes they're talking about the same issue. So that's when you then get what's called a movement-counter-movement relationship. Or some people, more academic, would call that the movement-counter-movement dialectic, a relationship between the movement and the counter-movement. A little later in the course, if we get round to it, we should be able to engage with some material by this guy, sociologist called Richard Gale, and he says, forget about the dyad, the two-part thing, the movement and counter-movement. We're looking at a triad, a three-part thing, because we've got a complicated relationship between a movement, its counter-movement, and then the state, or state agencies. And if you think about that then, it kind of explains a lot about what happens in terms of legislation, things getting blocked, things getting repealed, all the kind of things that are going on in England right now, where Cameron is trying to bring back hunting. There's lots of moves, and there's statements from, say, the police chief saying that they can't police or they won't police the hunting ban. You know, it's not their priority. You know, just because something's illegal doesn't mean the police will prioritise it. That's usually a kind of social construction, depending on things like the chattering classes and that kind of stuff. You know, so if there's a lot of political kind of clout about it, then they will kind of fess up to it. But if not, there's lots of bits of legislation that is just left to lie, really, and it's almost like ignored. You know. Okay, so this is a good definition to use in relation to the so-called animal rights movement. I kind of do the bunny rabbit ears when I do animal rights, because it's a controversial term. The animal rights movement is a phrase that is usually used to indicate people who say they're animal rights advocates, whereas I use a phrase like rights-based animal rights to identify the people who adhere to the philosophy of animal rights. So the animal rights movement, or the animal movement, the animal advocacy movement, is a bit of a philosophical mess. Most of the people in it, even though they call themselves animal rights, are not familiar with and don't adhere to the philosophy of animal rights. So there's a bit of an issue there that we can come to. Probably not so much today, but we'll start to touch on that, and then we'll move on. Okay, Marshall also notes that modern social movements are thought of as groupings, obviously, and organised outside of the mainstream of the political system. So that means that many social movements are interested in the political system rather than being an integral part of it. At the same time, many social movements aspire to what's known in political science as insider status. If you get insider status in terms of politics, then that means you get the ear of the minister or the prime minister or whatever, the Taoiseach, so you're right there, you actually can ring them up, as it were. When you're the outsider, you tend to be left doing demonstrations and presenting petitions, that kind of thing. So the difference between insider and outsider, we're going to encounter about 3 different types of insider-outsider in this opening statement. But some social movements aspire to insider status. Marshall obviously says that social movements are interested and significant in terms of driving social change. We know, of course, that social movements are purposeful. They have a purpose, and to some degree, at least, they tend to be organised. So much of what we'll say in general terms about social movement theory is going to be relevant to the animal movement as we know it, and as we tend to know it in terms of Ireland, England or Britain, mainland Europe and North America. That tends to be where most of it is, although there's a growing movement in Australia and those kind of areas. The focus is on a movement consisting of several groups and organisations which exists over time, and it experiences the highs and lows of campaigning. When we look at the inner life of a social movement, this is when things get fairly messy. We can expect a fluid and a changing picture. Certainly what we don't tend to find is any sense of linear development. Some of the early theorists assumed that there would be a linear development, as though social movements themselves follow some kind of career path. It tends not to be like that. There's more like cycles, and there's kind of troughs and peaks, that kind of thing. Now, according to RUCT, which is Strategies and Action Repertoires of New Movements here, and that's from, what's that? Am I gone too far forward? Yeah. So from 1990, he says that for the social scientist, this level of analysis, the inner life level, is more difficult to theorise because it's messier. Especially if, you know, in theoretical terms we want to generalise. That's difficult because, you know, it's difficult to generalise across movements. But also, in terms of our little kind of mini-course, the more that social movement participants know about their own movement, then the more open they are to reflexivity, thought about it, and the more that they're able to actually analyse the movement they're in, and so their movement makes a lot more sense in that sense. So I think that's one of the things that I hope is going to be the most useful thing about this kind of mini course. So we get the sense then that social movements have constituent parts based on individuals, based on organisations, ideas and so on. And quite often we characterise a diverse set of people as a group or as a movement. So the example we give about this is the feminist movement. So Tim Jordan here from 1995 talks about the unity of social movements. He says that feminism is constituted from a wide range of collective actions. And there's consciousness raising groups, there might be various types of demonstrations, there could be various types of direct action, and include a broad range of opinions on the nature of women's oppression. But then he says this: if it has any unity, that is because all actions somehow address the oppression of women. That's on the quote sheet. So, in that way, we can make sense of a label like the feminist movement. And what scholars have done with that is they've tended to identify at least several types of feminism. And in theory, you could talk about each type as a social movement within itself, but what tends to happen is you talk about different types and then you've got an overarching idea that they're in a movement, one movement. So you can talk about radical feminists or black feminists, you can talk about Marxist or socialist feminists, and probably the most numerical liberal feminists. And nowadays we also move on to issues like postmodern feminists or so-called difference feminists. So there's quite a lot of different types of feminists that have been identified, and then there's the argument about whether they are separate movements, whether they're in alliance with each other, or whether they are actually constituent parts of one movement. So using this same kind of idea, this kind of overarching thing, we've got the work of Robert Garner, who's a political scientist, and this is his first major work, Animals, Politics and Morality, and he uses the term the animal protection movement, which is the phrase that I use in my MA as well. And he uses the phrase animal protection movement to include the different mobilisations that variously concern with the well-being of animals in some way. However, what he mainly argues for is that the animal protection movement should be seen to incorporate two broad categories, which he calls the animal welfare movement and the animal rights movement. Both of these broad groups then are concerned with the plight of other animals, but they are based on different philosophies and they're sometimes in conflict. Often their outcomes will be different, what they want, as a liberation versus larger cases, that kind of stuff. They certainly often have different ideas about where they stand in relation to a nation's political system. The former, the welfarists, often act as system insiders. This is very controversial at the moment in the United States. And the people who are familiar with Facebook will know that Bob Linden, for example, is attacking the HSUS at the moment for its partnership with the egg industry and everything else. So often they will work as insiders. In the UK, you would have examples like Compassion in World Farming doing that. The latter, the animal rights movement, I'm getting the bunny rabbit ears, are often and sometimes reluctantly outsiders. Many in the rights grouping tend to reject conventional politics altogether, and then they focus on cultural change. So their audience quite often is said to be the general public and not politicians. And there's also some degree of that kind of thing with the media as well. Some animal advocates will retreat from all of that and won't get involved with any of that, and they'll concentrate on physically rescuing other animals and causing what they call economic sabotage towards the industries that they label the animal abuse industries. There are other animal mobilisations as well. These you could regard as movements in their own right, or they could be part of a bigger movement. Some take a rights or welfare line, or they suggest that you can mix and marry the two. So, for example, you've got anti-vivisectionists, you've got factory farm opponents, anti-intensive farming advocates, people opposed to hunting, the anti-blood sports lobby, the activists against zoos, some people specialise in work against circuses, and there are some people who campaign almost exclusively against fur. So the groups that tend to specialise tend to reveal that specialism within their name. So you've got the, I don't know if you can see it there, the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, the Irish Anti-Vivisection Society, both animal experimentation of course, the League Against Cruel Sports, the Irish Council Against Blood Sports. Then you have other groups which are more generic, and they tend to campaign on many fronts at once. So in the UK you have Animal Aid, and in Ireland you have the Alliance for Animal Rights and the National Animal Rights Association. To add some confusion to the idea of movement, some people would include conservation organisations as part of the animal movement, or at least a movement which is to do with the well-being of other animals. Then on top of that, you have the animal use industries, which is a separate category. Now, the animal use industries, they make a big claim about animal welfareism. They say that they're part of the animal welfare movement, but more than that, they claim to be the authentic voice of animal welfareism. So, by claiming the authentic voice of animal welfareism, they will attack the entire notion of animal rights. But they may support some animal welfare groups that we might recognise as animal welfare groups, but they will also attack and criticise some planks of the philosophy of animal welfareism. For example, Peter Singer's animal liberation position, they will attack that, and also they'll deliberately label that animal rights, whereas in actual fact it's not an animal rights position. So, most of that can be seen in this book, which is Harold Goudhier, and it's called Animal Rights, and the subtitle History and Scope of Radical Social Movement. And so he says, through educational efforts with their members, this is the kind of counter-movement or the pro-use movement, and to the general public through media, they are challenging and attempting to discredit the animal rights doctrines and beliefs. That's on your quote sheet. So he cites farm animal coalitions, that is groups that agree with farming of animals. He also talks about fur coalitions, and he also talks about defenders of animal experimentation. Just let me give you some idea of the kind of groups we're talking about here. Under the name Farm Animal Welfare Coalition in North America, you have the following groups. The American Dairy Science Association, American Farm Bureau Federation, American Feed Manufacturers Association, American Meat Institute, American Society for Animal Science, American Veal Association, Animal Health Institute, Commission on Farm Animal Care, Farm and Industry Equipment Institute, Holstein Association, Livestock Conservation Institute, Livestock and Marketing Association, National Broiler Council, National Cattlemen's Beef Association, National Broiler Council again, I don't know why that's in twice, National Lamb Feeders Association, National Livestock and Meat Board, National Livestock Producers Association, National Milk Producers Federation, National Pork Producers Council, National Turkey Federation, National Wood Growers Association, Poultry Science Association, Provinmi, I don't know what that is, and the United Egg Producers. These are the constituent parts of one lobby group in the States. And it says here, in addition to those industry groups, the US Department of Agriculture is also listed as a member. So, if we want to get some idea of our opponents and the strength and size of them, well, that kind of gives it. What Tom Reagan does, he talks about the American Medical Association, this is in his Empty Cages book, and he talks about how they operate. He says, a steady stream of press releases, memos, email messages, press conferences, and web statements, miscellany, denouncing ARA extremists, animal rights advocate extremists, I think that means, and lauding reasonable animal welfareists have flowed from the AMA and other biomedical research industries, public relations office, straight into the hands of reporters, news directors, and editors. So there's a big effort to discredit the idea of animal rights and to also differentiate it from a particular type of animal welfareism. So that brings us to your handout. So I don't know whether we want to go through this, but you can see that. But this is the National Animal Interest Alliance. The name itself is quite interesting because they suggest that by being used, that is in the best interest of other animals. And so we'll just pick out a couple maybe. Animal welfare is a philosophy that promotes stewardship of species and individual animals, embraces a human connection to the earth and animals that recognise humans as part of nature, blah blah blah. At the bottom, rejoices in the bond between animals and humans. What they say about animal rights is this. The animal rights is a political movement that opposes all animal use and most traditional relationships with animals, including eating meat, wearing leather or wool, biomedical research, owning pets, breeding dogs and cats, circuses, zoos, hunting, trapping, ranching, fishing, and learning about animals by hands-on experience. Goes through all that. And then for some reason there seems to be some name check right at the bottom for very right here, because it says, works for the day when people view animals from afar, which is quite interesting. So as you can see, a completely different version of things. The National Animal Interest Alliance claim that they're interested in they're dedicated to explain to the public the, quote, critical difference between animal welfare and animal rights. So the animal rights movement as we know it will see this group as part of the counter movement. Okay. If we remember the recent prime time about fur a couple of weeks ago in Ireland on RTE, the language that the fur growers were using is very similar to the language of this group and other groups in North America and other groups in England and one or two groups in Ireland. And they'll be saying things like, well, what these people want is a meatless, petless society. That's the kind of slogan that they come up with. If we're looking for insiders, counter movements in the UK, we've got the National Farmers Union, Seriously Ill for Medical Research, the Research Defence Society and Animal Experimentation, the British Field Sports Society, which is probably now subsumed under the Countryside Alliance, and then you've got specialist groups like the British Association for Shooting and Conservation, which used to be called the Wildfowlers Association of Great Britain and Ireland. In Ireland, you've got RISE, which kind of tends to cover all that, and there's been a concerted effort to bring all these groups together in order to kind of do for Ireland what these groups tend to do elsewhere. Going back a little bit, I said that some people would include conservation groups in the animal advocacy movement. Theoretically, they can be separated from the animal protection movement. One or two typically get included. Sometimes Greenpeace International might be, but certainly Sea Shepherd, it tends to be included as part of this movement, even though Paul Watson says that Sea Shepherd is not an animal rights group, and just look at the name, it's called Sea Shepherd Conservation Society. So how can all this be separated? Just very briefly, in terms of conservation, their concentration on species is the key, whereas animal rights proper would be concentrated on individuals. That would make a difference, especially the rights-based animal rights, which would see individual other animals as rights bearers and what we do to them as rights violations. Examples that I could think of about this, when I was in Wales, there was proposed cull of grey squirrels to protect the red squirrels on Anglesey, and also there was a large ruddy duck population in Anglesey, and what they would do in the summer, they would go to Spain and they would mate with a white-headed duck, and therefore they would produce a hybrid. One of those situations where two species could interbreed, which is quite rare, but these could. And so conservationists in Wales and in Britain and in Spain were trying to kill or cull the red ducks because they were having sex with the wrong type of, So again, the emphasis is on the species and not the individuals in the species. The animal use industries, like this one, can be separated by the fact of what they do to other animals. They actually use them and they promote using them for food, fibre, and a few other words like that, rather than what they claim to be. So Goudier then says that these animal use industries are a counterforce to animal rights, and notes that they concentrate their efforts on discrediting the genuine animal rights or animal protection movement. And he even claims that they tend to do that rather than promoting animal welfareism itself. In other words, they're kind of set up just to be an attack kind of thing, Rottweilers if you like, but they would dispute that. Okay, so just to end this little section then, I invite you to have a look at that one, some animal organisations. And there is a kind of key to this, which kind of puts what I've said into some context, although it would be a controversial context. Essentially, the key would be, if things are in bold, then they tend to be seen as animal rights groups. If things are just in normal, they tend to be seen as animal welfare groups. And the ones that are underlined are the ones where there's the most controversy about which camp they're in, essentially. Starts off as early as 1809, and like the Irish PCA wasn't royal at first until Victoria got involved, which is quite interesting. Then it moves through.
Why did they call them brute animals?
He would write about higher and lower animals, and it's really. There's a comparison really with sociology. It's embarrassing really, if you get any sociology book which is from the before the 1980s, it's got man, meaning humanity and kind of stuff and all that. Animal advocates still have a problem not calling other animals it, but certainly in those kind of early days they would say brutes, lower animals,
I'm just wondering if they're differentiating between wild and farm and domesticated animals in the definition of brute at that time.
Yeah, that's right. And there was a lot of that going on, and then there was the dumb animals thing, which sometimes just meant without language, but also again seems lower. So it's only been very recently that there's been some challenge to all that. In the sense that we are much more careful about our language now. People tend not to talk about other animals as it anymore, but you'll see it often. Facebook posters still do it. People in their general discourse will do it, and sometimes it's quite hard not to, especially if you get a bit fired up. You'll see a lot of people doing it, and that really is a testament to the depth of the culture that we regard other animals as items of property, which is where the it comes from. There is that argument. You see about babies. Sometimes they say, well, we call human babies it as well. Yeah. So the real push towards a kind of linguistic challenge was ironically kind of modelled on the feminist movement. And the classic case there would be in the feminist case of history became his story. As a political thing.
But what do you think in an era prior to domestication, just prior to farming? How are animals conceived? Are they given a female?
Prior to farming completely.
Well, yeah. Just looking back,
No,
I know it's
said that there was some kind of matriarchal societies that tended to see other animals as spirit forms. There is an intriguing argument that domestication and the concept of property and the concept of patriarchy developed in a similar kind of way. Now Engels took this on. It's a bit controversial, but it's an interesting idea, which is that men didn't actually know that they had much to do with the production of babies, because if you think about, you have sex, and then 9 months later, plop, baby. What's that got to do with the sex, right?
Yeah.
And the theory is that it wasn't until we started to farm other animals.
We got into monogamy.
Yes, but no, because then we start to see the relationships then, and pregnancy and this kind of stuff. At the same time, because we were starting to farm them, then they became items of property, so we started to fence them in, and then, the story goes, men wanted to hand them down to their sons. And so therefore, that means that they had to know who their sons were. And so the promiscuous horde that used to exist, with everybody shagging each other, as it were, could no longer exist because men wanted to hand down their property to their sons, and they wanted to know.
And they had established this because of the animals themselves.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the kind of story. It's a little bit of a controversial one, but it does kind of it sounds plausible. You know, it sounds plausible to me anyway. So. Okay, now we're kind of at the break thing. Do we want to take a couple more questions, or should we just have a cup of tea now and then get on with the rest of it and then bring it all together at the end? Should we do that? Have a cup of tea?
Sure.
No. Okay. So
Thank you.